Hey there, welcome back. Now we're going to talk about equalization, which is commonly called EQ. You've heard me mention this over and over already in this course. And in this tutorial, we're going to learn how to work it for mixing. EQ, or equalization, is very helpful in fine-tuning sound. When you're mixing, EQ is going to help your tracks better fit together sonically. And when you're mastering, you use EQ to bring consistency to the similar instruments and voices across your songs. EQ works by boosting or reducing the amplitude of specific ranges of frequencies or bands within your audio. The treble and bass knobs on your home stereo, as you've heard me say, are EQ controls. Even mics and preamps have built-in EQ circuits. For example, if they have a good high frequency or low frequency response instead of a flat response. EQ works the same way in your music software, only you use it with greater precision. You use EQ to boost or cut various frequencies in your songs. For example, if you want your vocal to have a little more boom, you would need to raise some of the lower and low mids. Sounds like an easy and quick fix for any sonic problem, huh? Well, guess again. EQ is often the most used and misused effect in a mix. Now, it's a wonderful tool because often we can't create the ideal acoustic conditions for a track. Let's say you're recording a band, but in order to maximize isolation, you mini-mic the acoustic guitar, which makes it sound pretty boomy and takes off some of the highs. Too much EQ and your work is going to sound artificial. Plus, it can also leave nasty artifacts in the music. Generally, it's better not to have to apply EQ, or at least not very much of it. If you find yourself needing to use a lot of EQ on a part, you might consider re-recording it. It's much better to have a high-quality input rather than to tweak and tweak. Generally, it's better to cut EQ frequencies than to boost them whenever this is an option. Cutting will make sure the mix sounds more natural, and it won't boost the mix's overall levels, which might lead to some clipping or unexpected frequency resonances. To avoid over-EQing your work, always keep in mind the objectives of EQ during mixing. You apply it to make a part stand out, to increase clarity, to emphasize, and to avoid conflict. Your EQ tinkering has different effects depending on the frequency band you're working with. So remember that different instruments and sounds fall into different parts of the frequency spectrum. Even if it's a low-tone instrument like a kick drum or a bass, it still has harmonics and other overtones that spread across a really wide range of the frequency spectrum. Making any changes anywhere in the spectrum on a track is definitely going to influence the sound of the instrument, even if you're not messing with the instrument's fundamental frequencies. So here we can see the fundamentals of a kick drum range from about 30 Hz to 147 Hz, so pretty low. But the overtones go as high as 6 kHz. The human voice has an even wider range of overtones. A man with a low voice can sing notes from about 87 Hz. That's about a low G, up to 397 Hz. That's around the G above middle C. But the overtones he makes range from 1 to 12 kHz. Cymbals and the violin have even greater overtones, up to 15,000 Hz. The snare drum has a really small fundamental range, from 100 to 200 Hz, but the overtones can go up to 20 kHz. On this chart here, I've got some qualities of 6 different bands in sound. Good presence in the lows can give power, but too much makes mud. In the bass range, you can get nice body if things are handled well, but too much will make your work boomy. The low mids give you that fullness, but too much will sound muffled. The mids give you power, too much sounds tinny. The upper mids give crisp definition, but too much is tiring. This area is what people who prefer classical music find really fatiguing about listening to pop or rock music, because here the EQs in pop and rock are boosted really high. The treble range gives you clarity and ping, but too much makes things hiss. This is where you find sibilants like s and sh. Let's say you boost your percussion a little, around 10 kHz. This gives you some additional brightness. But if you cut in the same place, you reduce the brightness. Too much cutting dulls the sound. By experimenting with your EQ plugin, you gain experience and understanding of how the band adjustments affect your genre and instrumentation. This is a pretty good thing to play around with. EQ is applied in envelopes or bands, like we've been talking about, and as I show you in this diagram. Most hardware EQ consoles have 4 bands. Your software EQ plugins will probably have more, sometimes up to 10 bands. Pro Tools uses a 7-band EQ built-in plugin. I'm going to take a look at Cubase's audio track equalizer. Each audio track comes with a 4-band equalizer. Now, we could also use one of the many plugins that this software comes with, but I wanted to start with a more simple interface. So here's what a standard EQ interface is going to look like. Basically, the interface and parameter adjustments in most EQ plugins are somewhat similar, so when you figured it out once, you'll be able to bring your knowledge to another plugin. For the rest of this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to use this particular equalizer. Then, in our next tutorial, we're going to go over some approaches and techniques for applying EQ to a song. This type of equalizer is called a parametric equalizer. It's called parametric because it allows you to adjust 3 parameters: the amount of boost or cut, the bandwidth, and the center frequency of the bandwidth. We've just activated the first frequency band. The number at the bottom here is called the Q. This is the bandwidth. It's how wide a chunk of the frequency spectrum on either side of the center frequency you want to affect when you make adjustments. This is really cool because it lets you make broad contour adjustments to a wider bandwidth or target a very small frequency range for zoomed-in tweaking. When you listen to your music looking for a specific frequency range, this is called sweeping. Sweeping lets you identify where a particular sound sits in the spectrum. Then you're able to adjust it up or down a little as you need. So say your kick drum is nice and beefy, but you can't hear the snap of the beater hitting the drum head very well. Boosting the lows makes the kick boomier, but it doesn't give you that snap. Set your bandwidth to be narrow. You want to sweep across the mids and the upper mids looking for the snap. That's the frequency for that attack. Now back off on the boost and adjust the bandwidth until it sounds more natural. So this is an important skill that you build up with practice. You can define a band in the equalizer by choosing a center frequency and then the Q or width. There's actually a formula for defining Q. It is the center frequency of the band over the bandwidth. So that's what that number is. Basically, the higher the Q, the more narrow the bandwidth. For example, if I choose a center frequency of 300 and I want to sweep on either side of 300 by 75 Hz, so my bandwidth range would be from 225 to 375 Hz or 150, my Q would be 2. So the center frequency would be 300, the bandwidth of 150 divided equals 2. Let me just repeat that again so it makes sense. So let's say my center frequency is 300. I want to sweep on either side by 75 Hz. That makes my bandwidth range 225 up to 375 Hz, and that's 150, resulting in a Q of 2. Now you also choose by how much to boost or reduce the volume at the edges of the bandwidth. Here in this example, the edges will be 3 decibels below the center frequency. Let's say the amplitude of the center frequency is 9 decibels. At 225 and 375, the volume is going to fall to 6 decibels. You'll be using different kinds of EQ curves to shape the frequency response. Through the spectrum, you'll use a peaking EQ to boost or lower. The shape looks like a hill or a trough. At the ends of the spectrum, a shelving EQ shape is generally used. That is, the frequency response looks like a shelf. They increase or decrease to a specified plateau and then stay at that level. You'd use a shelf to, for example, filter out low noise or hiss. Some equalizers give you built-in filters that are pretty handy. Generally, they're called low pass, high pass, and band pass. The terminology is kind of confusing, but let's talk about what they are. The high pass filter cuts the lows. In other words, it lets the highs pass. For example, a 60 Hz high-pass filter will lower the volume of frequencies at 60 Hz by 3 decibels, then attenuate or reduce the volume of frequencies lower than that by much more. So this can help you get rid of low-level noise. And it doesn't affect the tone quality as much as a gradual bass roll-off does. A low-pass filter cuts the highs out. In other words, it lets the low frequencies pass through. You put a low-pass filter at the top end of the frequency spectrum. A low-pass filter at 10 kHz will remove frequencies above that threshold. It'll lower the volume 3 decibels at 10 kHz and then much more after that frequency. This can reduce hissing without affecting tone quality as much as a gradual treble roll-off would. Some equalizers give you a bandpass filter that cuts frequencies above and below the frequency center of the band that you defined. Bandpass filters are good for troubleshooting problem noises. All right, let's play around with this equalizer a little so you can understand how to work the controls. First, let's take a look at the grid. On the y-axis, we've got the decibels measurement. This is so we can see how much we're boosting or reducing a band. In this equalizer, I can boost or cut each band by 24 decibels. Minus 24 decibels is down at the bottom. Plus 24 decibels is up at the top. When I deactivate the equalizer band, it shows the default value of 0 decibels, so that means no boost or gain at any frequency in this band. Now let's take a look at the x-axis. This shows the frequency as measured in hertz. From 20 Hz, that's a super low sound, to 20,000 Hz, that's a super high frequency. For each band, this number here indicates the gain or reduction in decibels. Let's take a look at my boosts and gains across the bands. So 0.1 minus 11.8, 0.2 plus 4.2, 0.3 minus 4.8, and 0.4 minus 0.4 with a low pass. When I click the knob to activate the band, I can adjust the gain manually, or I can just drag the point up and down. I can also use the slider in the console here. The change is reflected in the number field. The numbers below 10,000 Hz, etc., show the frequency at the center of the band. Band 1, 40 Hz. Band 2, 201 Hz. As I drag around, I'm sweeping for sounds. Band 3 is about 1800. Band 4 is set to 10,000 Hz, so I continue sweeping 0.2 here. I can also enter values for the frequencies manually in these fields here. The point will change on the chart display to reflect my entry. I can also drag the dot as well to move the value. The slider here lets me adjust the frequencies, and this is another way that I can sweep. Adjusting the frequency and the decibel level is how you sweep during playback in search of a sound, so keep that in mind. Down below, I define the cue. I can enter a value numerically or use the slider to define a bandwidth visually, and this is usually a bit easier. Remember, the larger the bandwidth, the smaller the cue. The smaller the bandwidth, the larger the cue. At the first point, my Q7 is pretty high, and that means my bandwidth is quite narrow, about 6 Hz in total. For point 2, my Q is small, about 0.2. And that means my bandwidth is quite wide, about 1,000 Hz. In this case, it doesn't make sense to have a wide bandwidth since the center frequency is only 200 anyway. This concludes our introduction to working with an equalizer. In our next tutorial, I'm going to show you how to apply EQ to a song during the mixing process.